And the topic today, as we go to the issue of marijuana, medical or otherwise, Colin Edstrom is in our studio this morning. Mr. Edstrom, you certainly have touched the pulse of the public.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. It's a controversial issue, and I hadn't seen that Insights West report that you referenced just a couple minutes ago there, Phil, but certainly it seems that the public sentiment is shifting towards favoring legalization of marijuana, and you saw that, I think, during the last federal election as well. It was part of the federal Liberals platform. I don't know how large of a part it was of their platform, but certainly it got plenty of media attention.
Pierre Justin Trudeau caused national headlines as he stood just a block and a half from our studio here down at Kerry Park, stood up on the podium and said, I not only want to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, I want to legalize marijuana in this country, and set off a bit of a furor. But certainly there's lots going on in this country that, and I'm looking at this piece out of the National Post, Green Machine, and here's the quote line, or the byline, if you will. Existing pot dispensaries are owned and operated by a mix of capitalists and campaigners. No one is certain what the future will hold, but the stakeholders are all, and here's an interesting turn of phrase, the stakeholders are all looking to take a bite of the billion-dollar brownie. Colin Edstrom, it is a multi-billion-dollar business.
It appears that it is that. I mean, it's tough to obviously, I suspect that it's tough. I've never looked at it in depth, but tough to actually monetize the value of it. But I will say, as somebody who really does enjoy bad dad-type jokes, this topic lends itself to terrible, terrible puns, not unlike that one right there. So for me personally, I have a vested interest as somebody who likes those jokes and who actually practices law as well.
Well, you know, I remember hearing a quote that has stuck with me all of my life. And the quote was, if you think that apples are the number one product grown in the Okanagan, give your head a shake, it is marijuana. And the second part of that quote was, and if somehow you could snap your fingers and remove marijuana from the economic equation of the Okanagan Valley, and here's the final thought, the Okanagan would go into an economic tailspin that it wouldn't emerge from in years. That is how large and how pervasive the marijuana business is in this valley. Whether you see it or not, it is there, and it's become very, very ingrained and integrated into our economic life.
Yeah, and perhaps because of that pervasiveness, the lines are sort of blurred, or I think at least our ideas of the legality of marijuana, the lines of it are blurred because it is fairly pervasive throughout our valley and throughout Canada generally, I'd say. So I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding as of right now as to what is legal and what is illegal. So marijuana is still, as of today, an illegal substance. Mm-hmm. It's still on the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It's still an illegal substance. In 2013, the federal government passed a regulation permitting the use of medical marijuana. So it can be marijuana, can be prescribed by your doctor to assist with certain ailments that you're facing, not unlike other drugs that would otherwise be illegal. Say, for example, morphine. You couldn't just go into the store and buy morphine or go out the street and buy morphine.
You need a prescription.
Exactly. You need a prescription or you need to go to the hospital. Same sort of thing with marijuana. So the lines right now are still a little bit blurred because it is pervasive throughout Canadian society, at least throughout Western Canadian society. But as of today, it is still an illegal substance, except in limited circumstances. Now, that may all be coming to a change. I understand. I think that the federal government has announced that they're going to put the bill to legalize and regulate marijuana before the House of Commons in the spring of this year. I could be off on that, but certainly the machinations are in work to legalize and regulate it with the federal government.
And I think the public at large is very conflicted because I know that not recently or not so long ago, three provincial premiers, Mike Harcourt, Ujjal Dosanjh, and I can't remember the third, but there were three, maybe even five provincial premiers in the province of BC, all advocating for the legalization of marijuana. Senator Larry Campbell, former RCMP Commissioner Larry Campbell advocating for the legalization of marijuana. It goes on and goes on and goes on. And then in that historic battle between Ottawa in the province of BC over marijuana dispensaries in BC, where the federal justice minister of the day under Stephen Harper was demanding that the Vancouver police swoop down and close down all of these shops. And you had the chief of police of the city of Vancouver saying, we got other priorities in this city besides a bunch of folks that are selling pot at a dispensary. And that very quickly defined where the city of Vancouver Police Department was on this. That confuses a lot of people.
No, absolutely. And it appears that confusion will likely be coming to a head. I mean, it remains to be seen what's actually in the bill, if they actually go through with, if it passes, for one thing. Obviously, the federal Liberals have a majority in the House, and so it's very likely that their bill will pass. But in what form and what sort of regulations are set up? But absolutely, I can completely understand the confusion. I spent first 6 years practicing law in Vancouver and just recently moved back to Kelowna. And Phil, as you and I were discussing earlier, there's a dispensary on every corner, and they appear to have the weight of law behind them. They appear to be legal. They appear to be operating just like every other business. But there are some serious questions about criminal law there.
In some cases, some of them are operating at a higher standard than most businesses would because they don't want to, A, attract attention, or if they attract attention, they want to be able to demonstrate and prove a high standard of professionalism, for lack of a better word.
Certainly. Some of them look like your traditional, say, hipster coffee shops, whereas others have green lights and they're spelt weeds. You know, the name of it is weeds with WEEDZ at the end of it. So yeah, no, certainly it's either end of the spectrum and everything in between. Right, exactly.
Where do you see this going? Because going into the federal election, if I did a story once, I did it 50 times. Canadian attitudes towards marijuana, Canadian desires to have marijuana legitimized, legalized, decriminalized, in Canada. There was the attempt to prevent people from growing their own pot in their own home, some of which has been turned aside in legal challenges. It seems that we're making this very, very difficult, and yet I look across the border at the state of Washington. They passed their bylaws, they passed their rules and the regulations, and it happened in the blink of an eye. You look at the state of Colorado, happened in the blink of an eye. You look at the state of Washington or Oregon, happened in the blink of an eye. And somehow it seems in Canada that we are in our ever ongoing need to drill down and examine and analyze and be worried and be frightened and afraid. When do you think that we're going to get there?
Well, I think that we are getting there, and of course, I mean that depends on your opinion. Certainly, the numbers that came out of that Insights West article earlier today support the idea that Canadians are moving quickly to accept the legality of marijuana. But certainly, there's still a large number of Canadians that have strong concerns about legalizing marijuana. I think the difference between Canada and what we see down in the United States is in Canada, criminal law is in the domain of the federal government. So if they're going to pass a law to legalize marijuana, it's not for the provinces to do that. It's for the federal government to do that, and that affects the entire country. Right. Whereas in the states, individual states, the federal government in the U.S. can implement some laws as well, but the states also have a say in their criminal laws. And so if they're going to start regulating marijuana in Washington, in Colorado, then they have the authority to do that. And you're dealing with a much smaller population, a population that might be more might have a more symmetry of interests. Right. Whereas in Canada, you're dealing with the second largest landmass in the world and
an incredibly diverse population.
Absolutely.
I found and just for the record, and maybe I need to state this clearly. Because a lot of people think because I passionately argue for the right to have legalized marijuana, decriminalized marijuana, people have this vision that I'm some sort of toker and smoker and taking advantage of this opportunity and this podium that I have to become an advocate for the marijuana industry. And nothing could be further from the truth. I do not smoke marijuana. I did a long time ago, but it has been a long time since I've held a joint between my thumb and my finger and inhaled some marijuana smoke. smoke a long time ago, people. But I thought it was really quite humorous at the Super Bowl of 2 years ago that was played in Denver at Mile High Stadium as the two teams arrived to play in the Super Bowl.
Again, a great pun, Mile High Stadium in Denver, right?
And a lot of people were laughing about that. But it was interesting because at Denver's Stapleton Airport, as people were leaving Denver after the Super Bowl was over, there were great big signs at the door that notified individuals that if they came into the airport terminal, they were suddenly in a federal zone, and they were under the rules and the regulations as imposed by the federal government in the United States, and that they should leave the marijuana in the cigarette collectors at the door before they stepped in to take their flight. And a lot of people always wondered whatever happened to all that marijuana that was collected at the door as people got to say goodbye to the Super Bowl. Right. Where did you think we would go in this conversation this morning, you and I?
Well, I think that where I wanted to go, part of me, was to discuss medical marijuana in the workplace, and how it affects workers, how it affects employees, how it affects employers. And I really like this discussion to start with because it shows the confusion around marijuana generally in society, and perhaps that also lends to some confusion as to what employers' rights are when dealing with an employee who is consuming marijuana in the workplace, and similarly what employees' rights are for consuming marijuana in the workplace.
Fascinating subject from Colin Edstrom, a lawyer with FH&P. Medical marijuana, and how does it impact on those of you who are in the workplace, and what are the rights of the individual working for XYZ Corporation, and what are the rights of the company? We'll be back to continue this conversation in a moment. On a Tuesday morning, in conversation with Colin Edstrom from FH&P, a Tuesday Morning Law Talk, interestingly focused on and talking about the subject is marijuana, medical marijuana, the people that use it, the challenges of people using it within the workplace to treat their ailments, what are their legal rights, and more to the point, what's the right of the law of the employer? And Colin, just as we came into the break, you said, the NFL and Colorado is a perfect example of some of the challenges that we're facing societally.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one, and this is U.S. law, so I'm not an expert on U.S. law, and I don't profess to be.
But philosophically,
it's similar, yeah, and I'm also a big football fan, so it's near and dear to my heart, I guess.
Right.
But it's interesting because NFL players that play for the Denver Broncos, or if they play for the Seattle Seahawks, play in a state that has legalized marijuana, and yet their employer, the NFL, has stated that marijuana is a banned substance. And if you're caught with marijuana in your system, you're subject to a series of screenings.
Fines and suspension
and
whatever. Yeah.
Drug testing, you're in a rehabilitation program. And so you're in a rehabilitation program and suspended and fined for engaging in an activity that is not illegal, but your employer has actually set effectively a code of conduct saying, aha, this is illegal in our eyes, for lack of a better phrase.
So then what allows the NFL to change its position on that, if it ever will? And I'm looking for speculation on your part, obviously, but it just strikes me that the employer, what's that phrase, is out of step with history right now.
Well, the NFL also exists across. It doesn't just exist in Washington. It doesn't just exist in Colorado. It exists in the other 48 states. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of the states it's still illegal to consume marijuana, that non-medicinal marijuana in those states. So it has to act, I guess, in accordance with those other states' wishes generally. But the NFL and the NFL players are in a unionized environment. And so because of that, they can bargain their rights. They can bargain their terms and conditions of employment. They can bargain they have a joint health and safety committee between the NFL Players Association and the National Football League. And so perhaps maybe when the next collective agreement is up, and I'm not sure when their next collective agreement is up, I'm sure we'll hear a lot of murmurs about a strike when it comes.
Yeah,
but,
no kidding. Yeah. We're going to strike over marijuana.
Right, exactly. That could be a big issue for them.
Let's bring the conversation closer to home now. Then I'm dealing with some cancer issues or back issues or blood issues. I have a prescription for medical marijuana that allows me to consume and use medical marijuana to treat my medicinal challenges. Where does that leave me with regards to my employer and the ability to roll up a joint, if you will, and go out in the back alley behind this building and have 3 or 4 tokes to maintain a level of THC in my system.
Yeah, and like anything in law, that's going to all depend on circumstances. But what you're really looking at here is there's an intersect between an employer's requirement to provide a safe working environment for all of its employees and an employee's right to not be discriminated against on the basis of a number of things, but including physical disability. And so we see this overlap a lot in workplace law. And in your case, or not in your case, but in the circumstance that you just discussed, it's difficult for employers, I think, to judge impairment at that level because it's not like it's Tylenol where I take so many milligrams and I know that the effect this is going to have with me
as a painkiller.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. Or similar, say you had an alcohol dependency, for example, and you had to consume a beer or 2 during the day. That's not prescribed. It's not prescribed, but say you had that to help treat your dependency.
Keeps it functioning.
Right. That's right. But we have as a society, we're able to better judge how somebody will be impaired or how 1 or 2 beers will impact them than, say, marijuana.
Okay, so the other side of this equation, though, is that there are strains of marijuana that are produced that have no THC hallucinogenic or buzz-building elements to it, that there is very definitely developed, established, and measurable medical benefits that do not mess with your eyes, don't mess with your ears, don't send you off into la-la land. They strictly function within your body, within your system, delivering medicinal benefit. Mm-hmm. That becomes a challenge.
Absolutely, and that's why there needs to be an open line of communication between the employee and the employer as to what they are taking. So to take a step back, as we discussed, marijuana in its current form is illegal. There are circumstances where it is not illegal, principally when it's been issued for medicinal purposes. So if you're consuming medical marijuana, you're not consuming an illegal substance. The Human Rights Code in British Columbia says that you can't discriminate against an employee on the basis of their physical disability. Other things as well, obviously, right. Age, sex, religion, so forth. But on the basis of their physical disability. If you terminate or if you change the terms and conditions of somebody's employment as a result of them smoking medicinal marijuana, then there's a pretty good argument. There's a pretty good argument. Be charged. Exactly. Yeah. Under the Human Rights Code, there's a pretty good risk that you've actually discriminated against them on the basis of their physical disability because you are taking action against them for consuming a drug, a legal drug.
Prescribed by
a doctor to treat an ailment, to treat a physical disability.
Are we ahead of the curve on this? Are we behind the curve relative to other countries and other places, other jurisdictions?
I think that we're ahead of the curve on this generally. I think obviously there's always going to be a couple countries, a couple jurisdictions that you kind of hold up as the flag bearers, the standard bearers, the gold standards, depending on whatever side you're taking.
Panama being one where they've legalized everything.
Right. And I know that there's been some kickback in the Netherlands in the last number of years in terms of their approach to drugs, but.
Can you hold that thought?
Yeah.
Because I'd like to go there when we come back. We do need to take a break. This is an interesting conversation. If you'd like to be a part of it, we invite you to join us. Colin Edstrom is my guest this morning from FH&P Lawyers. It's our Tuesday morning law talk, and we're talking about medical marijuana in the workplace. If you use marijuana in the workplace, if you have a medical prescription, with the anonymity provided by radio, love to hear the story and the challenges that you may or may not have had as you told all and basically talked to your employer. Or the bigger question is, did you and are you afraid? And is it still your worst kept secret in the workplace? That are you afraid what the reaction might be from your employer if you told them what you were about? Medical marijuana in the workplace is our subject. We're going to be back right after this break. And a conversation this morning with Colin Edstrom from FH&P Lawyers on our Tuesday morning law talk. We're talking about medical marijuana in the workplace. The campaign has been underway for a great number of years. campaigners looking to legalize the use of marijuana. They believe in the potential of the market, but they also believe in the potential of marijuana to ease pain, to ease anxiety, because there are all kinds of people that I know that do experience anxiety, and rather than taking depressants or chemicals in a pill, that if they roll up a number and have a toke or two, that suddenly that anxiety is gone. And so campaigners for medical marijuana believe that there is a productive, a happy, a creative, and a healthy life that lies ahead. Mr. Edstrom, we're clearly not moving as quickly as Canadians would hope that we are moving. Because certainly there were a lot of people that believed the federal government that they were going to move rather quickly on this as the Liberals came to power. That has not happened. It's caused some frustration and anger. But what it really leaves is people like you and employers hanging in the lurch, in the void, in the abyss, without really having any clear direction. And that is a mistake.
Yeah, it certainly is, because marijuana in society has been somewhat normalized. And so there is that confusion as to, well, can somebody, even though it's an illegal substance, a lot of people don't really view it as an illegal substance per se, in the same way that they may view more harder drugs, say, for example. So for some employers and some members of management, they themselves may use marijuana recreationally and may see no difficulty or have no problem with an employee during their lunch break having a quick toke, in the same way that they may not have any problem with an employee having a beer with their lunch.
Do we have some generational challenges here? Because you have the boss or the company owner who's in his mid-50s that maybe has never smoked marijuana, but he's got a very young staff that some of the members of his staff do, and he's got a serious problem with that. Because he's not experienced it, as opposed to the employer who regularly, when he goes home, uses marijuana and doesn't have a problem with it at all.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think if he was in his sort of mid-50s and grew up in the 70s and the hippie age, and he's telling you that he's never smoked marijuana before, he's probably lying to you. So I wouldn't believe him. But I
never inhaled.
That's right.
I was at the party, but I never inhaled.
That's right. No, but certainly there absolutely is a. I think, and I'm not basing this on anything apart from just my own experience. I think that there certainly is a generational gap in terms of acceptance of marijuana generally as a legalized and regulated commodity. I think I'm in my early 30s, and I think most people of my generation would be more inclined to support legalization and regulation of marijuana than, say, some older generations. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but certainly I think that there is a generational divide, and you may get some members of management who will have an absolute zero tolerance policy for very good reasons. One, it's an illegal substance. Two, you may be working in a safety-sensitive environment where you're moving big pieces of heavy machinery.
And that's where things come to play, isn't it?
Absolutely, because an employer has a duty to accommodate an employee that has a physical disability. And so to the extent that they have a physical disability and they are required to use, or not required, but they use medical marijuana properly prescribed in order to treat that physical disability, an employer has a requirement to accommodate that employee. And so that accommodation may require them to permit them to smoke marijuana at the workplace. Where it gets into a real issue here is where their job is not, say, a desk job.
I'm not going to let you sit at the controls of that 40-ton bulldozer or that backhoe.
Absolutely, because then you're an employer also has a reciprocal duty to ensure a safe workplace
for the other employees,
their employers, and that employee himself, or him or herself, and also to protect its own physical assets as well. If you're in charge of a $2 million piece of machinery, and say you're just operating by yourself in the middle of the woods, and you're absolutely no threat to any other worker, well, you're still a threat to actually potentially damage that $2 million piece of machinery. And so, for employers who have employees in safety-sensitive environments, the duty to accommodate, it might look a lot different than it would for somebody who can say, look, I can have a toke at lunch, it calms me down, it assists with my physical disability, and I can still do my job just fine.
If you use medical marijuana in your workplace, we'd love to hear from you at 250-862-2525. What was it like for you to approach your employer? Was your employer sympathetic? Or the bigger question this morning really is, does your employer know? Have you kept it secret? Are you afraid of what your employer's reaction might be should they discover that you are using medical marijuana? Which brings me to the point that I wanted to ask you. If the employer discovers that the employee is using medical marijuana, clearly that is not cause for firing, is it?
That's right. And so it would have to be, one, we have to be very clear about medical marijuana as opposed to just marijuana traditionally. So it's just because there's medical marijuana now doesn't mean that provides employees with carte blanche just to smoke marijuana or consume marijuana at the workplace. It's still an illegal substance, so it has to be medical marijuana. If it's not medical marijuana, if it's not prescribed
if it's hallucinogenic or THC laden, you've got a problem.
Right, exactly. And there's good reasons behind that, obviously, because it still is an illegal substance. But if the other thing is the medical marijuana has to be, and it usually would be, but it has to be prescribed because of your physical disability. It has to be related to it. So again, you have to be consuming it at the workplace or prior to getting to work because of your medical disability. An employee can't just say, well, I have this physical ailment. I'm using marijuana. Hey, it might not be prescribed, but I'm using it for a medicinal purpose because it helps assist me with focusing. That holds
no sway whatsoever.
That's right. Because at the end of the day, an employee then is still engaging in an illegal activity. They might be using it for medicinal purposes, but it's not a medicinal purpose that's prescribed by your doctor. It's a medicinal purpose that effectively you prescribed for yourself.
How deep can an employer go here? For instance, and I can create a scenario where employee XYZ has Dr. Goodlookson as his family doctor that he is regularly treated by. And Dr. Goodlookson does not do and would not ever prescribe marijuana, medicinal or otherwise, to any of his patients. He is an old-time doctor and believes in pills and the magic of chemicals and a herbal benefit. He sees none coming from medical marijuana. So now I go over here to Mixflick Street, where I know that there's a cannabis dispensary, and I also know that they have an in-house medical person who will write me a prescription. Am I at odds here?
Yeah.
And my question is, how deep can that employer go who can say, we notice your prescription doesn't come from the person who is on our files as being your doctor? So there's a couple issues there. The first is if your doctor is refusing to provide you, to prescribe you marijuana or quite frankly any other treatment. There's your out.
Yeah, there's your out. I'd suggest probably going to see another doctor he might have some other issues with the College of Physicians. If there actually is a treatment that is out there to assist you and he's refusing to prescribe it for political reasons.
From an ethical reason or whatever. Yeah.
It's a more political
religious,
than anything else. Yeah. There's another issue at play there, but actually an employer can go relatively far in looking behind the veil, and it raises some privacy issues. But the reason behind that is while an employer has a duty to accommodate an employee has a reciprocal duty to assist with that accommodation. So in order for an employer to determine whether somebody can properly still function in their job while they consume marijuana, it may be that they need to contact the physician who issued the prescription to say, how much is the person taking? What impact will that have? Are they still able to do this job? And so, because an employee has to assist with that accommodation. Again, they can't. It's not just carte blanche. You can't just say I can smoke pot whenever I want and get as high as I want at the workplace, and you can't touch me because I have a prescription. If an employer contacts the physician, and you can't see, but I'm using air quotes, at a medical dispensary, who's not actually a trained physician, Dr. Feelgood or something like that.
10 of these a day. Just describe anxiety to me and I'll give you a prescription.
Right, exactly. That raises some serious issues as to whether or not the person's actually a physician or not. And quite frankly, I don't know how these dispensaries work with that in that regard, if they're actually trained physicians or not. So I'm not sure. But the employer can require the employee to provide it with some medical authorization from his doctor or physician to say what you can and can't do and how much you're taking at the workplace. Because, again, they have an obligation to accommodate that employee, but they also have a right to protect their workplace and figure out, can you actually still do your job?
If you're afraid of what your employer's reaction might be and you hide it from them, instantly, if you provided cause for your immediate firing because you haven't been straight up with me, you've hidden the fact, you haven't, ascribed to the corporate philosophy of this company, and because you've hidden this from us, we can terminate you.
It sort of depends. Anytime you're looking at terminating an employee for just cause means you have a really good reason to do it. Dishonesty is a ground for termination for just cause. Now, is a simple sort of little white lie going to be enough? Generally not. But if you're consistently lying, misleading your employer over a period of time, then certainly that could raise an issue. But that's why we have the Human Rights Code in British Columbia, because it protects employees from discrimination on the basis of their physical disability, amongst other things. So if there
PTSD,
right, exactly. If you do actually have a concern about your employer's reaction, but you actually are using medical marijuana, then the Human Rights Code jumps in to assist you.
Is that when I come to you and say, listen, I'm employed by XYZ company. I've been using medical marijuana. I recognize that I probably should talk to my employer, but I'm really concerned about doing that. Would I retain your services to basically accompany me to ensure that I have some measure of protection, or I'm advised as to the verbiage that I might use, or more to the point, a lawyer to sit with me to judge the reaction of the company as I show all, tell all?
Yeah, and generally, you can absolutely retain a lawyer to assist you with that. But at that initial stage, it would be more of a hand-holding exercise,
right,
telling you what your rights are and what their obligations are. It's unlikely that a lawyer would be involved at that initial stage in terms of sitting in a meeting, because they wouldn't have any right at that point to likely be in a meeting with your employer. But really, it would be to help support you.
I want to take my dad with me, but he won't go with me.
Yeah. Well,
you're there as my susu, my comfort blanket, my best friend. You're my shoulder to lean on to give me the moral courage to be able to do this.
Yeah. Well, and so in circumstances like that, there may be an opportunity there for that. And by no means am I ever trying to talk lawyers out of work, but I want to be real and practical with everybody.
I'm not trying to talk people into lawyers' work either.
But generally, I think at that initial stage, what a lawyer can assist you with is letting you know what your rights are, what their obligation, what the employer's obligations are, and how they can approach their employer without feeling worried and anxious about what the employer's reaction will be.
Yeah. Colin Edstrom is in my studio for a couple of moments longer. I do need to take a break, as we're just coming up towards the top of the hour. I need to take a break. When we come back, some final thoughts from this rather spirited conversation with the lawyers from FH&P. As always, it's our Tuesday Law Talk. This one, absolutely fascinating. The challenges of medical marijuana within the workplace, and what protects you, and what rights does your employer have over you. Back in a moment. Today's conversation dealing with medical marijuana in the workplace, and Colin Edstrom in our studios this morning talking about this issue. Colin, not without challenge, definitely sort of takes society into places and spaces that the senior set doesn't want to go, but obviously the young working entrepreneur is trying to drive this forward. In the short term, we're going to have this sort of cultural divide, I think, between the two solitudes, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely, especially as the forthcoming bill in the House of Commons progresses, and indeed, if we do see legalization and regulation of marijuana, I think that there's going to be a lot. Obviously, there'll be a lot of press coverage, and there'll be a lot of opinions on either side. You know, how do you properly regulate it? Is it is it treated like alcohol? Is it treated more strictly than alcohol? Is it
Well,
treated less
I
strictly?
think this sort of fits into that same sort of sociological impact as physician-assisted suicide. It's not quite to that gravity, but it is definitely one of those hot buttons that society is really focused on and having a significant amount of conversation about.
Right. No, absolutely. And like physician-assisted suicide, it does raise charter issues, charter of rights and freedoms. Do we have a right? And the charter certainly came into play when the federal government initially passed the medical marijuana regulation. But do Canadians have a right to have unfettered access or regulated access, to something that could assist with their ailments?
Colin Edstrom, a pleasure to have you in the studio this morning. We went long and went overtime because of the depth of the conversation. If you are an employer and you have concerns and challenges with that, you could contact Colin Edstrom. His direct line is at 448-0924, or you can find him on the masthead of FH&P Lawyers. Pleasure to have you in the studio. Good subject for the day. Thank you very much. Colin Edstrom, gone for the day. We're out of here. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. Where will you be?